Please join me in welcoming our honored guests for this evening, Steve Grossman and Larry Tye. Did you turn your mics on?
I did. Can everybody hear? Yes. Good. Yours is on, Larry? I hope. Gentlemen, start your engines. Is that what they normally say at the Indianapolis 500? Well, welcome to all of you. We're thrilled to be here with you tonight. Larry has been traveling the country for the past number of months, talking about his book, talking about Bobby Kennedy's life, what we can learn from Bobby's odyssey, Bobby's own journey. And we're here tonight to explore that journey and some of the key ingredients that define a life that was cut short at age 42 in June of 1968, the night of the California primary. So we're thrilled that you're all here. Welcome to all of you. We're going to engage in a conversation for some period of time. We're going to leave plenty of time for your questions and your thoughts. We want to create a bit of a dialogue between ourselves and the audience. And of course, there will be, after the book talk, Larry is willing to stay and talk to you and sign some books. There are books in the back, and we welcome your desire to read the book. I've read it. It's a terrific book. Many of you probably saw the book reviews. It's hard to imagine a better book review and a more favorable book review than was written about this book in the New York Times. Not once, but twice. There were two different book reviews, equally laudatory. So welcome, Larry, and we're thrilled to be here tonight. So in the spirit of starting with Indianapolis, which was mentioned by Michael, and thanks to Michael and to LaSalle for being so generous in this presidential series as an opportunity for learning, for dialogue, and for growth for all of us, participants as well as listeners. But he mentioned Indianapolis, so let me start with a question. I'm going to start with a question that is motivated by a statement in the book by the American hero and congressman from Georgia, John Lewis. John Lewis said, and I quote, "When Robert Kennedy was assassinated, something died within America," close quote. So given Bobby's extraordinary leadership as a senator and presidential candidate on civil rights and racial reconciliation, as well as his memorable remarks in Indianapolis the night Martin Luther King was assassinated, what can we learn from his life's work that can help us find a pathway forward in 2016 and beyond in light of the events that took place over the past year and a half in Ferguson, Baltimore, St. Paul, Baton Rouge, Dallas, Charlotte, and Milwaukee, just to mention a few American cities that were riven by strife and by turmoil over the past year or so. Larry?
Great. I'm glad we're starting with little questions. So what I would like to do is actually take you back for a minute to who Bobby Kennedy was when he first became Attorney General and answering that question. And this is what I call the Bobby Kennedy clueless phase. And he was, as you will recall, appointed Attorney General because he had one qualification at the time, and that was being not just Jack Kennedy's brother. That didn't quite matter then. It was being Joe Kennedy's son. And Jack Kennedy was the president-elect, and he was willing to defy just about anybody in this country of America, except one person, and that was his dad. And when his dad said, "Bobby earned it, he helped get you elected by running your campaign, you will name him Attorney General," the fact that Bobby had never tried a court case and he'd never been in a courtroom trying a case in his life didn't matter. He may have been the least qualified and the least experienced person ever to take office as Attorney General. He also, at that phase, knew very little about civil rights, and what he was most concerned about at that early phase was protecting his brother Jack and not having anything happen out there that was going to embarrass him. And so you may remember back in the 1960s, there were teams of young African Americans and whites who traveled the country, especially through the South, in an era when buses were segregated and bus terminals were segregated. And they were called freedom riders. And they put their bodies and their heads on the line and often got beaten up to try to integrate interstate transportation and the terminals. And Bobby Kennedy essentially told the Freedom Riders in that early phase, slow down. We will get to this. We are doing some things in courts of law, we're doing other things, but don't go too fast because Jack is going to have a meeting with Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow, and it will embarrass him if we have racial violence in America. So the setup to understand Indianapolis is to understand the steep learning curve that Bobby Kennedy had to get to a point where he really understood what was going on in civil rights in America. And in that early clueless phase, there was one person in America who truly understood the potential of this guy, Bobby Kennedy. And that was a young civil rights leader named Martin Luther King Jr., who said, deep within this guy, there is good somewhere, and it is up to us to recognize that good and help pull it out of him. That's Bobby Kennedy in 1961. Flash forward to the day you were asking about, in April of 1968. Bobby Kennedy is campaigning in the state of Indiana, the first primary that he has entered in running for president. And he is flying in that day to Indianapolis. And when his plane, the Caroline, lands at the airport in Indianapolis, he is greeted by the young mayor, who went on to become a very old senator, named Richard Lugar. And Lugar says, I've got horrible news. Martin Luther King has been shot and killed. Lugar goes on to say, you are planning to deliver a speech in the middle of the black community tonight, and you will not give your speech. You will not go in there because if you go in, you might not come out alive, and if you come out alive, you will probably cause a riot. Bobby Kennedy politely listened, and then he ignored the advice, and he drives into the ghetto. He jumps up on the back of a flatbed pickup truck, and for the next 6 minutes delivers what may have been the most pitch-perfect speech that a white politician has ever delivered to a black audience in the history of the Republic. Michael, can we cue up? So rather than trusting me, and rather than my trying to mimic a Kennedy accent, we're going to watch here for a minute what Bobby Kennedy said that night in Indianapolis.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land with an effort to understand compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And what dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
So I want to just say a couple quick things about what happened that night. There was something really magical that happened that night in the Black Ghetto in Indianapolis. Bobby Kennedy went into the ghetto to embrace the African American community for the loss of their cherished civil rights leader Martin Luther King. And instead, that community embraced him for the loss 5 years before of his brother Jack. That night was the first time in public in 5 years that he had talked about the loss of Jack Kennedy. He still couldn't bring him that night to use the words Jack or my brother. He could only say a member of my family. I don't know how many of you remember the night of Martin Luther King's death, but that night in more than 100 cities across America, there were race riots. In Washington and in Chicago, chunks of the city burned that night. There were only a couple cities in all of America that had sizable black communities that didn't riot, and the most peaceful of them was Indianapolis, Indiana, and the reason was Robert Francis Kennedy. What Martin Luther King had said in 1961, ironically, was proven true the night of his death in 1968, that Bobby Kennedy had become the person that King had envisioned. And from that night in April of 1968 until Bobby died several months later in June, he was, and I can say this without hyperbole, but you should never trust a journalist who tells you they will say anything without hyperbole. Bobby Kennedy was easily the single most popular white man in black America. When he campaigned across the country, in every black community he went to, there was a simple sign that went up somewhere in that audience. and that sign said, "White, but all right." Now, that may not sound like much in 2016, but in 1968, saying that about any white politician who was coming into the ghetto asking people for something was quite extraordinary. And I think the answer, this is a long-winded answer to your question, but the answer is, in the era of Dallas and Baton Rouge, and most recently in terms of the deaths in Des Moines, Iowa, where we are a country riven, we can be inspired by only good things, by thinking back to what Bobby Kennedy was on the verge of doing in 1968.
Having worked for Senator Joe McCarthy during the communist hysteria of the 50s, having been a virulently anti-communist Cold Warrior as Attorney General, and in his attitude and actions toward Castro and Cuba, having authorized wiretaps of Martin Luther King and Martin Luther King's close colleagues during the Civil Rights Movement, how could Bobby Kennedy, in his short lifetime, become a liberal icon and eventually earn the respect and support of so many of the most prominent liberal activists in the United States?
So what he did was extraordinary. What he did in today's terms is almost unprecedented. He started out as one thing politically, and he became what looked like the mirror image of that. And he started out in 1953, taking the only job that was available to him after his time in law school. Anybody here, by the way, go to the University of Virginia? Great, so I can say anything I want about the University of Virginia. So Bobby Kennedy went to the University of Virginia Law School because he didn't get into Harvard Law School. He finished solidly in the middle of his class, and he was a relatively undistinguished law student. He was a Kennedy. He didn't have to work hard in law school. And when he got out of law school, after a couple of quick jobs, he went to work for his father's buddy, Joe McCarthy. He went to work for his father's buddy partly because his father told him to, but more importantly because Bobby Kennedy believed in what McCarthy was doing. He thought there was one person in America who was taking seriously the communist threat, not just in the Soviet Union, but in places like the U.S. State Department, and that was Joe McCarthy. He went to work for him. He stayed for 7.5 months. They were friends. Joe McCarthy would at times come home to his house at night and play with his toddler daughter, Kathleen. And Bobby Kennedy started out as a chip off his father's block and a Cold Warrior. But over time, over his 20-year public career, he learned in a way that politicians seldom learn. He grew in a way that politicians almost never grow. He grew by seeing what was really going on the ground, whether it was about civil rights, whether it was about what we were doing in Vietnam, whatever the issue was. And he changed. And today, we would look at that kind of change, going from Cold Warrior to liberal icon, and say he had to be doing it because he was a flip-flopper, or he had to be doing it because that was the way the political winds were blowing. Well, in fact, Bobby Kennedy came out for civil rights and against Vietnam before it was popular to do either. And I think he truly learned and grew and transformed in a way that can give us faith that that is at least possible in politics. And he was enough of an unusual character that I think we should study him because I wrote a book on him. We should study him, more importantly, because he tells us in an era when we're all more than a little bit frustrated by what's going on in politics, he tells us that politics that can be about something truly noble and about trying to do the right thing. And as I even say those words, they sound so corny. But it wasn't corny when he said it. When you heard him say those things, you want to believe it. And people really, you want to cry.
So let's shift gears a bit and let's talk about Bobby Kennedy and his family's relationship with the American Jewish community. It's well known that his father, Joe, was a Nazi apologist and an anti-Semite who referred to Jews as, quote, sheenies and kikes, and is described in your book as having, quote, stigmatized Jews as vindictive, ambitious, and self-pitying. That was the backdrop for Bobby Kennedy's growing up, and yet he ran for United States Senator in New York, in 1964. There were 1.3 million Jewish New Yorkers, and there was an intense amount of suspicion about the Kennedy family because of Joe and Joe's history during World War II, the run-up of World War II, and throughout most of his life. As a matter of fact, his relationship with the Jewish community, even after he was elected to the United States Senate, when he began to run for president, was a challenged one. People, notwithstanding the fact that he had written articles about Israel in the Boston Post in 1948, the year Israel was established, people were still intensely suspicious of Bobby because he was Joe's son. Matter of fact, just a personal aside, in 1968, my father was sitting home one night when Bobby called. And he said, "Edgar, it's Bob Kennedy. As you know, I'm in the middle of a battle in California, and I'm being beaten up in a big-time way because of my dad and his relationships with the Jewish community. I need you, Edgar." My father had known the Kennedys most of his life, most of their lives, and so my father, on very little notice, said to my sister Mary Ellen, who's here tonight, Mary Ellen, raise your hand. My sister Mary Ellen said, "Edgar, Mary Ellen, let's go to California." So for almost 3 weeks, they went to California and to house parties up and down the California coast. This print, this likeness of Bob, was signed by Bobby Kennedy just before they came back from California. They came back the night before Bobby was assassinated, and it expresses appreciation to Edgar and Mary Ellen Grossman for everything they did in California. So he needed help. Notwithstanding the fact that 4 years earlier he'd been elected and done very well in the Jewish community. So how did he overcome this history of anti-Semitism in his family, his well-known father, who was cashiered, if you will, by President Roosevelt, and how did he overcome that to become not only the senator from New York, but also do so extraordinarily well with Jewish voters all over the country? How did he make that transition?
He did it the way he did everything in his life. Most people had enormous doubts about Bobby Kennedy. He was not Jack Kennedy, who was sort of the benighted Kennedy. He was the Kennedy who started out, when he was a boy, being known to his father as the runt of his litter. He was not just the smallest, he was the one that Joe Kennedy felt was the least likely to amount to anything. And everything Bobby Kennedy did in his life was having to prove himself. He had to prove himself to his father, he had to prove himself to skeptics in the American Jewish community and in the New York Jewish community, and he did it by appealing to them through actions, through the actions of caring about fighting poverty, which was something that Jews had embraced as an important issue forever. He did it by supporting the state of Israel in a way that very few politicians did, beyond anything he had to do for token reasons. He did it by visiting delicatessens on the Lower East Side of New York and trying to do all the things a standard politician did. Only he didn't understand that he was in a meat-only Jewish delicatessen when he asked for a glass of milk. He did it a bit clumsily at times. But one of the many tragic ironies in the life of the Kennedys was that Bobby Kennedy, who started out life doing exactly what you were talking about, which was having to outrun the stigma of being an anti-Semite, at the end of his life was killed by an assassin who killed him because of his support for the state of Israel and for American Jewry. He starts out being accused of being an anti-Semite, and he is assassinated because he is pro-Semite. And that was the Kennedys, and that was what horribly happened to them too much. But Bobby Kennedy, anything that ever accused him of being biased in any way, I can say was something that A, was unfair, and B, that he learned that you overcome not by saying it's unfair, but by showing people what you can do.
3 very short quotes from Larry's book that deal directly with his upbringing and how he was treated in his family. At one point in the book, Larry writes that he was, quote, the forgotten child in a family of overachievers. He says, this is Larry says, he spent his life purposefully defying the low expectations others had of him. And finally, he said, and I quote, he had grown up as an outsider, an underdog within his family, and would always identify with both. Larry, do you think that the fact that he identified so closely, so genuinely with the impoverished, with the impaired, with American Indians, with farm workers, with South African blacks during apartheid, do you consider this all an outgrowth of his upbringing and how he felt, treated the way he was? Is that, I don't want to create too much of a psychological analysis of Bobby. On the other hand, there seems to be a direct linkage between feeling always the outsider and identifying with the outsiders, the downtrodden, the other.
Sure. So I want to give you 3 short answers to that. One is, it's the way he grew up. He was the outsider in his family. He was always having to prove himself. So it was easy, if you grew up being called the runt, it was easy being, forming an identity with people who were the smallest or the, who had the fewest opportunities. Second was his epiphany moment in his life, and the thing that I think made him even more sensitive to the underdog was at a moment in November 1963 when he had everything. He was Jack Kennedy's advisor on issues involving the Justice Department. He was his advisor on issues involving foreign policy. Jack turned to Bobby more than he turned to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had it all at that moment. He was the closest thing that America has ever seen to a co-president. And at that moment, Jack is killed and Bobby loses it all. And he went through an intense 6 to 7 months of serious clinical depression. And those are not my words. Those are the words of Ethel 50 years later, looking back on what happened to Bobby after the assassination. And at that moment, from then to the rest of his life, he became more and more sensitive to the underdog and more of a tender guy. And whatever initial inclination he had because of his upbringing, combined with the loss of his brother and seeing that everything you think is important in the world can come crashing down around you. And the one last reason that I think that Bobby Kennedy identified with the underdog, in explaining the last reason, I want to explain that Joe Kennedy had an expectation for his sons, a very unusual expectation, which is that all of them would become president. He would start with Joe Jr., and then it would be Jack, and then it would be Bobby, and then it would be the baby Teddy. Rose Kennedy, who you will recall died at age 315, praying in church, and Rose Kennedy had a much more modest expectation for her sons. She wanted one of her sons to become a priest. And had Jack Kennedy been a priest, I think he would have been the Pope, because that was how Jack related to the world. He was always a little bit intellectual, a little bit elitist, a little bit above it. Had Bobby Kennedy been a priest, he would have been a parish priest, because that is how he related to the world, and that is why he related to underdogs. He was down there at the grassroots experiencing things. He was talking to children at their eye level, and he was seeing himself in the eyes of all the underdogs.
So I think we're getting a picture of a man who was an extraordinary paradox, who had personal qualities that drove him constantly. Larry says in the book that he was a combination of mind-boggling narcissism and unmatched altruism. Larry says that was an entangled blend of Machiavellian contriver and man of conscience. He said he had a prodigious capacity for holding a grudge, but he also had the ability as he grew older to turn, quote, rage into outrage. The Village Voice's Jack Newfield, we all remember Jack Newfield, those of us who are old enough to have read The Village Voice, said, quote, he was constantly at war with himself. So this is a complicated human being. Yet, as he matured, the best of Bobby Kennedy emerged. He had overcome some extraordinary moments in his life, the holding of the grudge, J. Edgar Hoover, Jimmy Hoffa, Roy Cohn, Lyndon Johnson. These are celebrated relationships that did not go well in most cases. Can you talk a little bit about that paradox and that rage within himself and how he was able to synthesize all that and come out to be the person that he became during his years as a senator, post the assassination of his brother, and during the presidential campaign?
Yes, if we want to do that in part by telling you why I wrote the book and what I thought about Bobby at the beginning and at the end. I wrote the book because Bobby Kennedy was, when I was growing up in high school, the hero. I had a poster on my wall that I thought was a quote from Bobby Kennedy, and it turned out it was really a quote from George Bernard Shaw, borrowed by Bobby Kennedy, but he was one of my heroes, and the chance to write a book about one of my heroes was extraordinary, and I thought that Bobby was the liberal icon, that he was at the end of his life, and the one that America seemed about to back for the Democratic nomination, and I think it would have become president in 1968. In the course of doing research on the book, I saw more bad things about Bobby than I can imagine finding with just about anybody. I found that he did a whole lot of fudging in the course of making his brother Jack president in 1960. He did things that, for a lawyer and maybe for a campaign manager, were clearly unethical, to the point where Richard Nixon said that he learned his best dirty tricks by watching Bobby in 1960. I watched him during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he presented the insider version of what happened in the crisis in his famous book, which was made into a movie called 13 Days. And that book said that he was the great dove, calling for a blockade rather than an attack on Cuba. And that was only half true. He was calling for airstrikes for the first 5 or 6 days, and then he turned into a more modern. And his book didn't tell us that his secret year-long war, called Operation Mongoose, against Castro, is part of why missiles ended up in Cuba in the first place. So I saw a lot of things about Bobby that gave me pause. At the end of the book, Bobby Kennedy was more of a hero of mine than he'd ever been. And that's because I believe that heroes are only truly able to be heroes if they're flesh and blood. If you understand what's right about them and what's wrong about them, and if they're generally growing in a direction that you can relate to. By the end, by 1968, this character, who was far from a saint, was on the cusp of putting together a coalition that in 2016 terms was uniting what we call angry, white, working-class Donald Trump supporters, who were the people who supported Bobby from his Cold Warrior days. He was uniting them with Hillary Clinton's coalition of liberals and minorities. And he was building bridges in a way that I don't think has been done in the last 50 years. Building bridges that offered hope that a divided nation could actually come together for good. And how he did this synthesis is beyond me a bit, but that he did it, and that he did it in a way that offers us a model today, is beyond doubt.
Sticking with the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you buy the book, and I hope you will, the account of Bobby's transition, of Bobby's journey through that Cuban Missile Crisis is a page-turning part of the book, as many parts are. Larry says, there was never just one side of Bobby, as he showed during those nail-biting days in October of 1962. But remember, the Democrats had an election to win or fight in November of 1962, just a month later. So I guess the question is, since as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis, however it played out, whether Bobby's version was the accurate version or not, Jack Kennedy's approval rating in November of 1962 was 74%, and Democrats gained 4 seats in the U.S. Senate. Unheard of midterm election. That doesn't usually happen. So here's the question. Did Bobby Kennedy rewrite the facts of the crisis to serve his brothers and his own political needs?
So he initially was rewriting them to serve his brother's political needs, but the book didn't come out until after his brother was dead. And in the end, he rewrote the book to serve his own political needs. And when you read, if you go back and read the book 13 Days, Bobby's very short book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, you would think that the real hero of the crisis was not Jack Kennedy, it was Bobby Kennedy, who was there whispering in his ear, telling him what to do. And as Kenny O'Donnell said to him, you know, I thought your brother was president during the crisis and not you. And the truth was that Bobby would have written the book that Jack had been running in 1964. He would have written it to serve Jack's political purposes, because Bobby was always there, serving the Klan and serving brother Jack. But with Jack gone, he did it in a very bold-faced way to serve himself.
So Bobby Kennedy was referred to, and has been referred to, Larry calls him the master strategist of his era. He was an amazing political strategist. Many of us remember the campaign in which Jack Kennedy got elected to the United States Senate, 1952, Henry Cabot Lodge. Bobby Kennedy put captains, precinct ward captains, in 289 of the 351 communities in Massachusetts. This is 64 years ago. And he had captains in all 289 communities with 600 more people living in them. He ran teas all over Massachusetts in communities and had Kennedy women hosting those teas for voters. That was repeated in 1960 when they had coffee with the Kennedys. These are 2 cups, paper cups that were printed. My father actually printed 100,000 of these cups, and they had coffees with the Kennedys all over the United States, on TV, in wards, precincts, and it became a very sort of fashionable kind of a grassroots activity and organizational vehicle. In 1960, they had dossiers on every delegate, opposition research, dirty tricks, and of course it didn't hurt when you had an unlimited amount of money, and Joe made an unlimited amount of money available. From master strategist to visionary to liberal icon to a person whom we look at during this campaign with less than a week to go as the kind of person who could quote Aeschylus at a defining moment in the political history of the 20th century in the United States. How did this master political strategist begin to internalize all of those values and become the values-laden liberal icon that you describe in your book that is really the subtitle, Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal Icon?
As he was growing and developing his liberal ideology, he never lost the other half of who he was. And in the end, Bobby Kennedy, I like to use 2 words to characterize who Bobby Kennedy was becoming, or had become by 1968. And that is, he was a tough liberal, which is what many of us have been yearning for 50 years. He was incredibly liberal, but he had never lost the tough side. I think he was half Machiavelli and half Che Guevara by the end. And he thought that liberals who just were content to sort of spout nice ideology but couldn't get things done were useless. And he was, in my mind, sort of half Barack Obama and half Hillary Clinton. And having that synthesis in one person was extraordinary. Having that synthesis in one person who, as I say, in 1968, he would have won the convention in Chicago. You may remember, people remember Bobby's speech, the last speech of his life after he had won the California primary. He delivered a speech, he went into the kitchen at that hotel, that Ambassador Hotel in California, and he was shot. The last words that he said to that audience and to America before he went into that kitchen were, anybody remember? Say it again, right, you got it. On to Chicago, which meant that the next morning he was due to go to Chicago, and he was due to meet with the then famous, powerful mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley. 50 years later, Richard Daley's son, Bill Daley, Barack Obama's chief of staff for a while, Bill Daley says that his dad was about to endorse Bobby Kennedy that next morning. I'm convinced what would have happened is, with the endorsement of the most powerful political establishment figure in the Democratic Party, Richard Daley, that the odds were that he would have become the nominee. And what Democrats did back then, like what Republicans did, is the 2 top vote getters, or the 2 most popular people, united and formed a ticket. Jack Kennedy formed a ticket with a guy he hated named Lyndon Johnson so that they could be elected. And I think Bobby Kennedy would have formed a ticket with Hubert Humphrey, and if there was anybody in America who knew Richard Nixon's vulnerabilities, it was the guy who 8 years before had led his brother Jack's successful campaign against Richard Nixon. So my thesis, and nobody can prove me wrong, is that Bobby would have been the nominee, and he and Hubert Humphrey, with the taint of the Chicago riots, Humphrey still came within a whisker of beating Nixon. Bobby Kennedy and Humphrey, I think, would have won overwhelmingly. And the last point, which is the least stretch of all, is America would have been a very different place in 1968 and today if Bobby Kennedy instead of Richard Nixon had been elected president.
So my final question, and then we're going to turn it over to you. Megan, I think we've got a microphone that we can circulate so that members of the audience who'd like to ask a question can be heard. The presidential campaign. 1967, anti-war activists are looking for a candidate to challenge Lyndon Johnson. They go to Bobby Kennedy. He says no, and they pick Eugene McCarthy. 8 days before the New Hampshire primary, Bobby decides privately that he's going to run. March 12th, Eugene McCarthy stuns the political world in New Hampshire. 4 days later, Bobby announces. March 31st, Lyndon Johnson bows out. April 4th, Martin Luther King is assassinated, and then Bobby proceeds to run the tables, with the exception of Oregon, in Indiana, Nebraska, South Dakota, Washington, D.C., and California. What kept Bobby Kennedy out of the race in the early going, given the fact that this was a defining moment in American history with the Vietnam War raging? He had now become an anti-war activist from his earlier trip back in 1951 when he was totally pro going to war and protecting American interests. What changed when Eugene McCarthy clearly had gotten into this race and had earned the respect of liberal activists? And how did he overcome the liberal animosity that he created by coming in and stepping all over Eugene McCarthy's victory in the New Hampshire primary?
Great. I'll try to answer that relatively concisely. What happened was Bobby Kennedy had three totems in his life in terms of what he believed in. He believed in the Catholic Church, he believed in the Kennedy clan, and he believed in the Democratic Party. And the notion of taking on a sitting president like Lyndon Johnson, and especially a sitting president that was his brother's vice president, was anathema to him. And it was only over time when he saw, A, that he had no choice, and B, that Johnson might not win anyway, that he finally got up the resolve to do it. And when he did it, when he announced the way he did, 4 days after New Hampshire, nobody knew in those days that he had actually made the decision 9 days or 8 days before that. When he announced, a famous columnist named Murray Campton wrote a telegram to Ted Kennedy and said, "Your brother's entry into this presidential race proves that St. Patrick didn't drive all the snakes out of Ireland." And that was the skepticism that America and the American press corps started out that campaign. I want to tell you just a really quick story about how it ended up and how he overcame that skepticism by telling you about a single reporter that started out as the most ultimate skeptic. And this was a reporter named Dick Black Death Harwood. He was a reporter for the Washington Post. He was called Black Death because he was Black Death to any politician who ever did anything wrong. He'd send them to jail, he'd send them somewhere. But he was the toughest politician, the toughest reporter at the Washington Post. He had been a Marine, and he had helped take Iwo Jima during World War II. That's the kind of tough guy he was. And he was the perfect guy that Ben Bradley said, "You will cover Bobby Kennedy, because I don't want somebody covering Bobby who might fall in love with him." And Harwood started out as the ultimate skeptic. The first week that he was covering Bobby, he went out and played touch football with him. He came back with a bloody nose that he thought might be broken, and he came back convinced that Bobby played dirty on the football field like in politics. He didn't want to believe in this guy. Over the course of the next several months, Harwood watched Bobby Kennedy go into white communities and black communities and give precisely the same speech. He told audiences what they didn't want to hear. He told whites and blacks, number one, we need safe streets. And the only way we're going to get safe streets is to have racial justice. He was telling the truth, which was something counterintuitive for a politician to be doing in those days as in any day. And people believed in him. Dick Harwood believed in him to the point where near the end of the campaign, he went to Ben Bradley and said, "Take me off the campaign. I fall in love with Bobby Kennedy." Bradley, who 10 years before had fallen in love with the Kennedy family, said, "No, you've got to stick it out." I want to end by saying the most eloquent of all the eulogies written to Bobby Kennedy were not Ted Kennedy's famous eulogy, were not little David Kennedy, Bobby's son's eulogy. It was Dick Black Death Harwood, who wrote the most eloquent of all. He was the guy who was out there watching Bobby every day, and he saw something that he'd never seen before, and it was so inspirational to him that he wrote the most extraordinary moving eulogy that I've ever read.
So my father used to say that we were all born with one mouth and 2 ears. We should use them in that proportion. So we want to listen to you. Megan has a microphone, so if you'd like to ask a question to Larry, or pose a question to Larry, Megan.